whereas Pezeshkian and Zarif and their clique will cause problems for the resistance axis and will try desperately to compromise, they're not going to get anywhere because the US won't have it. Europe can't offer them anything on its own, as we've seen from the Russia situation, as we've seen from like a country like Germany being told by the US, right, we demand that you now cut your own legs off by basically increasing hostility towards the Chinese. Despite there being a 44-year, I believe, economic partnership between China and Germany and what was once West Germany, the Americans say, right, screw all that. We demand that you basically up the hostility. So this is now imperialism's self-reinforcing cycle, which will ultimately destroy them quicker because they are no longer in a position where they can offer even cosmetic concessions to potential collaborators in these countries. Ultimately, there is a national liberation process that Lebanon as a whole needs to go through still to this day to free itself from US domination and the domination of its local proxies, which include Israel, which include the Saudis, which include the Gulf states, all of whom play a very big role in Lebanon. And until that process is completed, that national liberation process is completed, the fight that Hezbollah can put up against Israel is going to be compromised. I think it was 2008, around about that time, that there was some talks between Israel and the Syrian government, and Bashar al-Assad, to his credit, refused to normalize on the basis of solidarity with the ongoing Palestinian liberation fight. And Olmert said in this interview, which I will try and find this and post it on my Telegram page later, that was the moment that Assad was doomed. Particularly Trump came in, tore it up because he was in alliance with the most extreme, rabidly reactionary forces in the US that were too dumb to realize that Obama was playing a slightly more clever imperialist game with Iran and also with Cuba and with other countries as well, which is offering normalization, offering the olive branch to these pro-capitalist forces and hoping to strengthen them and therefore cause internal problems that way, basically. Thankfully, Comrade Donald, in his long-term mission to be an accelerationist candidate in the destruction of dollar hegemony, as in both cases, he's going to come in and basically kick these guys in the nuts, essentially, the Iranian compromisers. Because he's going to come in this time and he says he's going to re-establish maximum pressure against Iran. Therefore, that sweeps the legs out from Pezeshkian and Zarif, because they can't just offer the total capitulation that Trump will demand and that his backers in the US will demand. And so, in a sense, the Iranian Revolution will be saved in a strange way by the sheer intransigence of imperialism. Imperialism cannot afford now compromises. It demands, its system requires, the complete destruction and defeat of Russia, the complete destruction and defeat of Iran, and ultimately China itself.
So good day, everyone, or good evening, everyone. We are here today again with Alexander McKay, and I invited you, Alexander, because I saw some of your excellent analysis of what's happening in West Asia, and we're currently, of course, very interested in what's going on there. I should say, of course, Alexander is of the Marx Engels Lenin Institute, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. I just quickly looked to be sure that I didn't make a mistake. And you also have an excellent YouTube channel where you go into many of the things that are going on around the world geopolitically and also locally, by the way. And I wanted today to talk a bit about what's going on in West Asia, and especially with relation to the ceasefire that we see, and also what's happening now in Syria. So before we start, welcome, Alexander.
Well, thank you for the returning invitation, guys. It's good to be back, and a lot to get into. I think the discussion probably became a lot more complicated by events of the last like 48 hours or so.
Mm.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'll just start right into it, jump right into it. My question to you is, Alexander, how do you feel about the ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel, or we could even say Hezbollah and Israel? Some say it's a victory. People are very. You have one school of thought who are super optimistic about it, but then you have another school of thought who are very pessimistic, and they say that. Some would say even that Israel has been given a lifeline because they were losing the attrition war against Hezbollah, and now they have a way of slowly chopping up the resistance one by one. And it seems that the second school of thought has a bit of a point, considering that what we are seeing now in Syria. So, what is your perception of this, Alexander?
I think that before making judgments, it is important to actually evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses, genuine strengths and the weaknesses of both sides of this. And that is, of course, that behind Israel ultimately lies the strength of what is referred to in many circles as the collective West, but I refer to it mainly as the US imperialist bloc, which has a very strong interest in not only retaining Israel as its military outpost in the region, as its way of projecting its power into West Asia, but also in order that Israel can serve as a tool to bludgeon resistance movements. And the US has, objectively speaking, an interest in the destruction of the resistance axis from Yemen to Gaza and the West Bank to Lebanon to Syria, the popular mobilization units in Iraq, and to ultimately Iran itself. This is an aim that they have had going back an awful long time. I mean, if you look at those countries I've just mentioned, many of them were on that notorious list all the way back in 2001, because this is a requirement that US imperialism has to subjugate all of these countries under its rule. Israel is one tool by which they aim to complete that process. The Gulf states have been historically another one of those tools, the Saudis another. And so we need to be clear-eyed about what has been actually agreed to here and what the Israelis have been compelled into. I would say it is a partial defeat for Israel, but not necessarily a fatal one as yet. It is a partial defeat for Israel because the publicly announced aims of Netanyahu and his fascistic cabal that consists of that makes up the Israeli government, they publicly declared that they were going to push Hezbollah back above the Litani River, that they were going to destroy Hezbollah. They clearly, along with the US, had very much the idea that if they took out the leadership of Hezbollah, assassinated its political and military leadership as far as they could, then the organization itself would collapse. That was, to me, that's absolutely clear that it was not just an Israeli plan with regard to the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. It was a US plan and a British plan, come to think of it as well. That was what they wanted to do, was to do the pager attack, which we all recall, then take out the leadership. Then they hoped that that would cause a collapse in Hezbollah's ranks. This did not happen. It of course caused disruption, but what was revealed was that Hezbollah was a far stronger organization, both in terms of military capacity and its deep-rootedness in Lebanese society, than the US imperialists expected. So the collapse did not happen. The Israeli army, even by according to Israeli media commentators, performed poorly in the attempted invasion of southern Lebanon. They were not able to get beyond, some say 3 to 4 kilometers, some say 1 kilometer into Lebanon itself. They tried various different methods of advancing, all of which were ambushed. They lost over 60 Merkava tanks in the battles in the south. And they lost, well, depending upon which total you believe, hundreds of men possibly like over 1,000 wounded. Again, we don't know. The Israeli military censorship is very severe, so we will have to wait to see what the ultimate totals are. But by even Israeli accounts, the Israeli army is suffering a crisis of confidence in the ranks and a crisis in its leadership. So from that perspective, Hezbollah has achieved, I would argue, a partial military victory in terms of preventing the Israelis from launching the invasion, preventing deep into southern Lebanon, preventing them from establishing the buffer zone that they wanted, and having to have Netanyahu agree to revert back to largely the deal that was there in 2006. All of that represents what I would call a defensive success, where we have to recognize that the resistance axis has certain limitations is in terms of the role that Hezbollah plays in Lebanon itself and the structural long-term weaknesses of the Lebanese state, which have been deliberately created and fostered by imperialism since it was created in the carve-out by French imperialism, almost 100 years ago now initially. And it's been kept weak, and it's been kept in a state of sectarian division quite deliberately in order that imperialism can more thoroughly exercise control over it. So, for instance, more recently, I believe that Lebanon was essentially told by imperialism, you can't join China's Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, even though that would be tremendously beneficial to the development of Lebanon, even on a capitalist basis. The imperialism said, no, you're not doing it. And because the Lebanese political system has been designed essentially to make sure that the comprador element in Lebanon, which doesn't just consist of the Christian bourgeois, it also consists of various bourgeois elements who are Sunni, and even some a much smaller minority of sort of comprador elements in the Shia community. That comprador group has basically a stranglehold over the politics of Lebanon. So that you have a situation where you have a Lebanese state which is too weak to do even the most basic elements of state management. Like a lot of the people who run the state are direct tools of imperialism. So, for instance, their central bank governors have long been tools of imperialism. The state is essentially broke and is dependent upon imperialism's goodwill for financing itself, for running its affairs. The Lebanese army, such as it is a creation of US imperialism and is there principally to essentially act as a police force for the US and for Israel. All of these give the resistance in Lebanon, mainly consisting of Hezbollah and its allies, a real problem, because not only are you facing a direct enemy in the form of the forces of the Israeli government from the south, you are facing a potential gun in your back from the north. And we know that during this conflict, the US's policy was to try essentially to cause a disintegration of Lebanese society. That was an aim they were consciously pursuing. They were trying to provoke their allies inside Lebanon to launch some kind of rebellion against Hezbollah, some kind of stab in the back. This did not succeed, and I think it didn't succeed because of the very strong sympathies that the great majority of the Lebanese population, I think, does have for resisting Israel, even if they're not directly involved with Hezbollah, even if they maybe have differences with Hezbollah. The great majority of the Lebanese population does not want to be subjugated by the US and its Israeli proxy. So for those reasons, I don't think that the US policy was going to succeed in that way. But the US, even though it is a declining power, has the ability in places like Lebanon to cause a lot of trouble. And one of the factors that I think that the Hezbollah leadership inevitably has to consider is how far can we go with this without something happening in the rear, without the US managing to stage something. Doesn't matter if it doesn't succeed. Doesn't matter if all the proxies they throw into this die. But if they create enough chaos behind the lines, then that will, they hope, compromise the Hezbollah effort on the front lines. And that tells us two things. One, that it's quite remarkable that Hezbollah as a resistance movement has gone as far as it has in terms of holding back the Israelis, but also that ultimately there is a national liberation process that Lebanon as a whole needs to go through still to this day to free itself from US domination and the domination of its local proxies, which include Israel, which include the Saudis, which include the Gulf states, all of whom play a very big role in Lebanon. And until that process is completed, that national liberation process is completed, the fight that Hezbollah can put up against Israel is going to be compromised by the presence of these comprador elements who are more than prepared to send Lebanon back into the hell of like the 25-year plus long civil war or 20 years long civil war that went on from I think the middle 70s through to the early 90s. So these are the factors where I think we have to bear in mind here. So to return to your question about what this is, a partial victory in that Israel and Netanyahu in particular has been, I would say, very much suffered a severe political humiliation in that his publicly stated aims have not been met. He has run into a lot of domestic political problems now from his left and his right because he's agreed to something which he said he never would. But as to whether this will last, I really don't think it will, because first of all, the internal situation in Israel is becoming more and more unstable. This will make any Israeli leadership, whether it is Netanyahu or whether it is Gantz or whoever else that they manage to build a government around, will have to lash out at their enemies again. And you have an unresolved situation there in southern Lebanon. And also you have the unresolved situation in Gaza, which they still can't nail down their victory there for all the horrors that they've committed. So this is a temporary cessation, I think, that the US is trying to make the most out of by further dividing and further weakening the resistance axis by doing what they've done in northern Syria as well. So in my view, it's a temporary cessation that will maybe last until the new year, and then whoever is in charge of Israel will be encouraged by the fact that you have a fanatical, very, very reactionary, even more reactionary than the Biden administration, possibly cabinet in the form of Trump's gang coming in. This will encourage the Israeli reactionaries to think that they can have another go at this. I don't think it'll necessarily go their way, but this isn't a very much an unresolved situation that I think will inevitably flare up again.
Yeah, speaking of unresolved situations, the Syrian civil war, we just saw another chapter in that bloody war. What do you think? How do you analyze this offensive from that? I forget the name. They're a former Al Qaeda offshoot that is rebranded to try to retain U.S. government support. Do you think do you see this as a largely irrelevant development for broader West Asian politics, or do you think that this is very closely tied to the ongoing wars in Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon?
I think it's very, very closely tied, and it always was. Going right the way back to the beginning of the Syrian civil war, this is something that was. I mean, you don't need to take my word for it. Look at the words of former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, the man who was in charge in the 2006 war, where he said in an interview a while ago that he was wanting to do a normalization process with the Syrian government in, I think it was 2008, around about that time, that there was some talks between Israel and the Syrian government. And Bashar al-Assad, to his credit, refused to normalize on the basis of solidarity with the ongoing Palestinian liberation fight. And Olmert said in this interview, which I will try and find this and post it on my Telegram page later, that was the moment that Assad was doomed, because clearly, again, the aim of the US imperialists was to try and hive off elements of resistance, to do deals with them, to separate them away. And if Bashar al-Assad had agreed to that, then the US would have welcomed him into the fold for now. You remember the deals that Muammar al-Gaddafi didn't exactly save him in the end. But the war in Syria is the US's adaptation to the limitations that came to be placed on them after their failures in Iraq. again, to go back to the list from 2001, Syria is on that list. The big one was, of course, was Iran. It was an illusion that people fostered for a while in the Obama administration that this had somehow changed. That list is not dependent upon presidents or the composition of the US Congress. That is a list that is based upon the needs of US imperialism in West Asia, the need to crush any independent state or any state that can conceivably get in the way of their schemes. And Syria represents this, which is why they have, and the British are involved in this as well, of course, for a long time sponsored the various incarnations that spun out of the old Muslim Brotherhood. There was the uprising, I think it was in 1984 in Syria, which was crushed by Assad's father. That organization, which again spun off from the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, did not go away. They stayed underground. They went into exile. They were fostered by the CIA, MI6, and the Saudis and the Gulf states. And that's who was unleashed back in 2011 when this all began. And the aim was specific to bring down the Syrian government and replace it with a stooge regime, not with a liberal face, but with a Salafist face. One that would scream and shout about Islam and death to heretics and that kind of stuff, but at the same time be a completely compliant tool of US imperialism. And there was recent statements made, and this was again confirmed in the Israeli media from HTS, the rebranded Al-Qaeda operation in the north of Syria, that they would normalize relations with Israel because their primary enemy is Iran. And anybody who essentially opposes US imperialism. So these are quite clearly the tools of US imperialism. They were reactivated. I think that, of course, you can't just launch an attack like this overnight. This has clearly been in the works for a good few months, that this plan that was being operated through, of course, Turkey, with the Erdogan regime being heavily involved in this. And they clearly, I think, wanted to do this. I mean, this is my interpretation. They had an idea that they would be in a much better position with regard to the south of Lebanon than they are. They were forced into the ceasefire, but they were so far into this operation, they probably felt like they couldn't delay it. And they might as well do this to knock the resistance axis off balance in another way. And so this is linked specifically to what's been going on in both South Lebanon and in Gaza. It's very much an operation which is designed to try and destroy the Syrian government. I don't think that's going to succeed. I think that one of the reasons we saw so many fakes and psychological operations I think particularly through Friday and Saturday, was to try and convince everybody that the Syrian government had already fallen, spread panic, spread confusion. And then what we'll see is, I think that the forces that the HTS has available to it are probably much more limited than they first seemed, and their ability to sustain a fight much more limited than it first seemed. So yes, it's very much linked in with the wider strategies that the US is pursuing. The fact that the US came out and said, we have got nothing to do with it, but this is all the fault of the Syrian government, basically confirms that they did have something to do with it. And the aim was specifically to try and get rid of the Assad-led government. So yes, it's the same strategy that's been pursued for decades now. And it's the same bunch of ultra-reactionaries that they've got doing the fighting for them. And final point on this is that a lot of these characters, in fact, it seems certainly a significant majority of the people doing the fighting aren't Syrian. They're brought in from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, I think to a certain extent Kazakhstan. You've got the Chechen exiles there as well. A lot of these guys also turned up in Ukraine. Certainly
Xinjiang,
the Chechens
China,
did.
by the way, Xinjiang, China.
Yeah. Definitely, you've got the fundamentalist types who've been pushed out of Xinjiang, and deservedly so, and they've ended up there as well. So this is like an international mercenary army that's been put together. Same kind of people who were unleashed in Libya 13 years ago. Again, it's the same group that they send everywhere. There's different regional variations. There's more of an Islamic tinge to it in West Asia and North Africa. There's a Ukrainian fascist element to it, of course, in Ukraine. But the same types turn up over and over again, which is you get these, to use the Marxist term, sort of lumpenized criminal gangs given a essentially some kind of ideological branding, but it's all the same methods that they use: terror against civilians, brutalization of national minorities and religious minorities, horrendous brutality to exercise towards women. Often you find when they're pushed out of an area that they're running some kind of like black site prison and or like biological experimentation system, which again has been confirmed to exist in Ukraine. We don't even know what the hell's been going on in the Idlib, where they've been based for so many years. All the same tactics, all the same groups, all traced back very clearly, actually, by authors such as Max Blumenthal to the CIA and the Department of Defense, MI6, Ministry of Defense in Britain. These aren't even controversial things to say anymore, I don't think, because it's been so well established who these people are and who they work for.
Yeah, I think it's controversial for people that haven't read anything about it. It was only several years ago that I first read a book about the U.S. and UK government support for radical Islamic fundamentalist groups as a kind of bulwark against socialism and secular Arab nationalism. But for most people who've never encountered that, I think that's the only real source of controversy. Once they actually learn that that's an established fact, I'm curious to see how they would react.
Well,
Yeah.
it's something that I've discussed frequently with my comrade and collaborator, the journalist Kit Clarenberg, and he's covered this extensively as to how far back the collaboration goes, but also like how crucial it is. So in places like Bosnia, the collaboration was there, in Kosovo as well. And even shortly after the beginning of the supposed war on terror, the collaboration was reestablished very quickly, if it ever stopped. But again, as you say, Peter, you're right, which is that this is, of course, never mentioned in the pages of The Guardian or on the BBC. So if that's your source of news, you are going to be very surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and it also makes you wonder the deeper stories behind 9/11. To be very honest, considering the relationship you see right now between Israel, the United States, and all these Al Qaeda types in Syria, and it's also just it's also depraved. It's almost as if it's the U.S. also chooses these kind of mercenary groups because they really don't have to stick to any rules of engagement like an army. So you get slave markets, child decapitations. It's so incredibly brutal, all these things. So I wanted to ask you a question that is very much related to this. How do you see the relationship of Iran in all of this at this moment? Because there are two schools of thought, you could say. One group says Iran is doing the long chess game and it's doing exactly what it wants to do. Others are saying, for example, our previous guest, Kevork Almashan, who said that under the new so-called progressive government, you see a kind of a change and actually a kind of naivete in that he seems to be falling for negotiating again with the West and backing off a little bit. How do you see that, Alexander?
Well, I think that the situation in Iran has to be viewed in terms of there are several different trends within the Iranian political system, which have always been there ever since the revolution of 1979 to 80. You have the revolutionary wing of the Iranian political system, which is very much anti-imperialist, which is very strongly in favor of waging the national liberation struggle to its conclusion, and in terms of backing the other national liberation forces in the region. That has been traditionally centered around the offices of the supreme leader, Khamenei, and before him, Ayatollah Khomeini. And that's very much rooted in the revolutionary tradition in Iran. For instance, like the Basij popular militias, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps to an extent. And then you also have, though, elements which are, let's be honest, like capitalist, a capitalist class which has comprador elements within it. There's no denying that in Iran. And they are linked to, their business interests have been linked to the West. They want to access Western financial systems. They want to do business in the West. And for that reason, they have been behind every so-called reformer government that's come into office over the last 30 years, really. You've had Mohammad Khatami being one of them, and now you have this guy Pezeshkian being the latest incarnation. And you have with him a guy called, his name is Javad Zarif, who's a long time and notorious wannabe compromiser with the US imperialists, desperate for a deal, reflecting the class basis of the forces behind that government. The difference, I think, is that the Iranian system does have this split within it between the president and the Guardian Council, and you have the popular element within it as well, not just from the formal elections, but from the mobilizations in defense of the revolution, which go on, which constrain the comprador element to a degree, but they can still work their, disastrous magic, because they are, again, desperate to be readmitted to the world order, which is led by US imperialism. The reason why they have not been is because US imperialism won't accept anything other than total capitulation. Like the JCPOA, the so-called nuclear deal, was supposed to be this was like the big thing that the previous so-called reformist government wanted to base their approach to foreign policy around, that they would give up the idea of ever attaining nuclear weapons, that they would submit to international inspections, and in return, they would get sanctions lifted on Iranian business interests, and they will be able to engage with the European Union, the British, and the Americans. And this would be the way for this Iranian capitalist class to essentially move forward with their agenda, which I think relates to dismantling revolutionary legacies in Iran and essentially pursuing a decisively pro-capitalist path. Much like with Russia, that was blocked really by the imperialists themselves. Particularly Trump came in, tore it up because he was in alliance with the most extreme, rabidly reactionary forces in the US that were too dumb to realize that Obama was playing a slightly more clever imperialist game with Iran and also with Cuba and with other countries as well, which is offering normalization, offering the olive branch to these pro-capitalist forces and hoping to strengthen them and therefore cause internal problems that way, basically. Thankfully, Comrade Donald, in his long-term mission to be an accelerationist candidate in the destruction of dollar hegemony, as in both cases, he's going to come in and basically kick these guys in the nuts, essentially, the Iranian compromisers, because he's going to come in this time and he says he's going to reestablish maximum pressure against Iran. Therefore, that sweeps the legs out from Pezeshkian and Zarif, because they can't just offer the total capitulation that Trump will demand and that his backers in the US will demand. And so, in a sense, the Iranian revolution will be saved in a strange way by the sheer intransigence of imperialism. Imperialism cannot afford now compromises. It demands, its system requires the complete destruction and defeat of Russia, the complete destruction and defeat of Iran, and ultimately China itself. And so you're not going to get the kind of compromises that the cleverer imperialists could have engaged in, like the compromises around nuclear weapons that Reagan and George Bush Sr. engaged in with the capitulationist clique in charge of the USSR. That's not possible today. That's not possible today because the system in the US is too far gone. It's just the political representatives reflect a longer term decay, and that longer term decay demands an injection of capital on such a degree that it can only be obtained via the complete destruction of two countries, possibly three. And that leaves Pezeshkian with very little room for maneuver. So whereas Pezeshkian and Zarif and their clique will cause problems for the resistance axis and will try desperately to compromise, they're not going to get anywhere because the US won't have it. Europe can't offer them anything on its own, as we've seen from the Russia situation, as we've seen from like a country like Germany being told by the US, right, we demand that you now cut your own legs off by basically increasing hostility towards the Chinese. Despite there being a 44-year, I believe, economic partnership between China and Germany and what was once West Germany, the Americans say, right, screw all that. We demand that you basically up the hostility. So this is now imperialism's self-reinforcing cycle, which will ultimately destroy them quicker because they are no longer in a position where they can offer even cosmetic concessions to potential collaborators in these countries. And so to go back to the basis of your question, it's going like Pezeshkian and his group are going to create problems. There's no point denying that. Ultimately, though, because the imperialists are so intransigent, I think it will help to strengthen the understanding of those in Iran who are looking at this and maybe thinking they can have a deal. The intransigence of imperialism will push more Iranians towards an understanding that is more revolutionary. Just as it's pushed even like some in the Russian capitalist class to understanding that, oh, we can't have a deal with these people because they're the only deal they will accept with us is our total capitulation and the destruction of the country. So that's the way I see things. This is imperialism essentially in its downward cycle, can't be flexible anymore. And this will undermine the Pezeshkian group in Iran ultimately. Not that they can't create problems, not that they're not going to throw spanners in the works because of their desperation, but ultimately there's no deal to be had for them.
And speaking of Europe, I've found it kind of shocking, to be honest. In 2016, what I thought the silver lining of Trump's election victory was that the rest of the world would realize that the U.S. ruling class, at least part of it, a big part of it, are a bunch of clownish or psychotic cowboys, and that they'll need to create structures outside of the U.S. To balance it, really. But that, of course, didn't happen. It seemed instead that in all European capitals, they just rolled over and accepted Trump as president and continued to fall in line with U.S. imperialism under Trump. This time we've got, another term of Trump. Do you see anything different on the horizon? Do you see any indications of the growth and development of a movement to extricate Europe from its subsidiary position under U.S. imperialism?
At the moment, I would say that what you're seeing is the bits of elements of the European populations are sort of groping towards this, but they're doing it in a way that is not going to succeed. So let's take, for example, the growth of the AfD in Germany as an example, a reactionary political organization that talks about leaving the EU, that talks about getting out of the war against Russia. Ultimately, though, it will not be able to do either of those things, even if it came into the possession of the chancellorship in Germany. And that is because the AfD are fundamentally a reactionary bourgeois party. And reactionary bourgeois parties in Europe have not been able to make a break with the alliance with the US. And that is because the alliance with the US is very, very deeply rooted and goes back to the end of World War II at the very least. And it is reinforced constantly by the fact that there is over $1 trillion every year in terms of foreign direct investment goes into the European area from the United States. And a large amount also goes back again to the United States. There is also that long-term trading relationship there. So even though the trading relationship between a country like Germany and China has increased in importance over the last 40 years, that long-term relationship based on capital exports, based on trade, and also based on what is referred to as state capture in places like Germany, Italy, etc., that can't be undone by typical bourgeois forces, I don't think, because too many people in the German, French, and Italian ruling class have a vested interest in maintaining that relationship with the US. And then if we go from the material base to then the ideological realm, I mean, I remember conversations with people who were in senior positions in academia, senior civil servants in my previous occupation, where they are completely ideologically submissive to the US. And I think that again goes back to the fact that the US after World War II really did save European imperialism. They did. They resurrected it from a point of near death. The only reason why French neocolonialism, British imperialism were able to hang on in places like Africa and retain influence in places like Southeast Asia was because of US sponsorship. And so the ruling classes of these countries do owe the United States considerably. And that enables them to exercise not only material control over these countries, but also an extreme level of ideological control. And to go back to the Ukraine situation for a moment, one of the things that really brought home to me the full nature of imperialism on an ideological level was watching how all of this talk about Ukraine's shield of the West crap that was being talked. I call it crap, but in a way it's true. Ukraine is being used as a weapon against Russia on behalf of the ruling class of principally the United States, but also Britain, France, Germany as well. And what you realize is this idea of civilizational supremacy is so very, very deeply rooted in all of these ruling classes, in all of the governing groups, in all of the so-called intellectuals and the think tanks who serve them. It is essentially like the confirmation of like everything Frantz Fanon wrote, basically, into how these people view the world. They're no longer able to summon up like the material dominance that they once had. And that, in actual fact, rather than making the capitalist classes of Europe look at their situation and think we need to diversify our interests, it makes them cling ever tighter to the relationship with the United States, even though the United States, as Angela Merkel admits in her memoirs, is again cutting the ground out from underneath the Europeans constantly to serve its own interests. They cannot conceive of another way forward for themselves. Now, that's again derives from a material problem. But then again, you then get into the ideological problem. They can't conceive of a world where they bargain with Russians, with Chinese, with Iranians, with Indians on an equal basis. To them, it's got to be colonial, or at least look like it's colonial. Otherwise, it's not acceptable. And my fear is that what will ultimately happen is that Europe will go through the governments led by these more and more reactionary figures, like Meloni, who comes in and fails, like Le Pen, who will come in and fail, and the AFD, who will do the same thing. And I think we're probably into something similar in
Wilders
Britain.
in the Netherlands, a hyper
Yes,
Zionist.
yes, and ultimately a guy who is essentially just another more rabid servant of the US, but who dresses it up in all this like national pride falsity. And call it falsity because it's essentially just a more aggressive, even more nakedly racist version of what's there already. It's like people like in this country freak out about Nigel Farage and the various clownish right wingers, but all they are is a more open expression of what's already there. There's not really that much difference between what Nigel Farage openly says and what Keir Starmer does. Not really. And you get into like the actual opinions of like supposed left-wing Labour MPs, you'll find as much racism, as much rabid chauvinism and pro-imperialist sentiment as you do in the right wing of the Tory party or in the opposition benches in Farage's group, the Reform Party. So what will happen is like the Trump thing. Trump is just like this open expression of all the gangsterish, crude, chauvinistic tendencies that exist within the US ruling class. He's with all the liberalism stripped away, which is why a lot of liberals don't like him, because it's unvarnished. We'll get that unvarnished version in the European countries. That will fail. And ultimately, then we won't get a change until there is some kind of movement that can break with the US alliance. And not only that, can break with it on the basis of a complete break with the imperial past and present as well, and a reconciliation of ourselves to a role in the world which is based on a relationship of equals, not based on extraction of super profits from hyper exploiting various different markets, but to actually deal with the world on a country to country basis as equals. That's going to take essentially the removal of the entire governing elites in the West, all of them, and it's going to take a fundamental change into how certainly Britain operates. Britain operates at the moment as essentially a parasitic hedge fund that happens to be attached to a country. And like, we're not going to be able to fundamentally change this country without removing that as the operating model. That might take several years. It might happen more quickly. But at the moment, what you're seeing is the European populations in the west of Europe, I think the east is slightly different, going through this cycle of removing delusions from themselves by trying these various different things, trying to recreate post-war social democracy, Corbyn, Mélenchon, ultimately Zara Wagenknecht in Germany, all of which will ultimately fail. Some of the population trying to get behind like these ultra-reactionaries, Wilders, Farage, AfD, Meloni, Le Pen, all of which will fail. Then eventually we will have to come face to face with the fact that this whole period is now over. The colonial and neo-colonial period is over. This will now need to be reckoned with. And that will mean a fundamental change in all of these Western European countries. And everybody will have to recognize that the way that economy and society is structured will have to be fundamentally different. In my opinion, the only answer then is the socialist road, because there's no way that British capitalism can be reformed. This is too parasitic. It is too far gone. The same is true in France. The same is true in the Netherlands. The same is true in Germany. And if we allow it to continue, all that's going to happen is it's just going to turn inward. So you're going to get more and more like nakedly racist parties emerging as the ruling class tries to preserve itself by amping up the divisions within the working class, be they religious, be they based on the color of skin, national origin, etc., because that's the way they do business across the world. They're already bringing their colonial management tactics back into the homeland. That's the next step. But ultimately, to go back to the answer to your question, the European populations will go through this cycle of trying all these different methods. On all of them will fail because none of them can address the giant material hole that is opening up underneath the Europe. The EU will be the first thing to go, followed by probably NATO itself, and then we will really have to have a reckoning with our own ruling classes.
From your lips to God's ears, I certainly hope that is what happens and soon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. And I have one small question. We're almost at the hour. I have one more small question to stay on that optimistic kind of a sentiment here at the end. The fall of the Western Empire is a kind of optimism, I must say. So, Alexander, you say we need that consciousness that we cannot go ahead on this road, that capitalism is inherently failing. If we keep doing that, it will become increasingly parasitic. So my question is, how can we increase this consciousness among people that we need to radically change? Because I must admit, I am shocked at the lack of knowledge among Europeans about how the world works, also internationally. People always complain about, for example, the Americans, but I must say among Europeans, say my own country, for example, I'm shocked at how little people actually know what is going on outside of the borders, or even questioning capitalism as a system itself. So, how do you see us going forward in that matter?
I think that I think your judgment is correct, especially among the so-called educated classes. It seems to be just as much ignorance as the so-called non-educated, but with an even greater degree of like chauvinism and ill-deserved senses of supremacy. I think the shocking thing to me was that people are still operating on like end of history logic, in certain circles. Now,
Yes.
to us, here in Britain, which again, oldest continually existing capitalist country, oldest imperialist country, um, what we've got to do is really rebuild ourselves as a as a movement, based on essentially those layers of the population who have at least reached the understanding that things cannot continue as they are. The problem with the so-called educated class in Britain is that so many of them are tied into institutions which are essentially paid to create, so-called work that justifies the situation as it is, or calls for a return to an earlier model. What you've got in the rest of the country is a growing layers of people. And again, this I know that from French comrades that this is true there. It's also true in Germany and other Western European countries. You have a growing layer of the working class that is being impoverished. You have a shrinking layer of, the petty bourgeoisie who still do fairly well out of the system. You therefore, what our task is to base ourselves on a combination of those who are maybe a little higher up the social ladder, who have realized that things are going wrong, but the mass base of our movement must come from those who are at the sharp end of the decline. Because even though those people will have a mixed consciousness, they will come with a lot of funny ideas, because you grow up in an imperialist country. Your brain is filled with propaganda, no matter which class you're born into. And again, the ill-deserved supremacist sense. But at least those who are on the sharp end of it have realized that the country itself is sliding down and it's taking them with it. So those with a lower material basis for delusions will be the basis of of communist parties going forward. Our task is to build in those areas where the Western left has not been active probably for 40 to 50 years, which is the working class areas of places like Britain, which have been neglected, which are sliding further into poverty. That must be the basis of our movement. Only that way do we have build ourselves a degree of immunity to the delusions that sweep through the intellectual layer and the petty bourgeoisie, that things can be changed, that a change of government can do something. At least the man slide or the woman sliding into poverty in a working class area might again have some strange views, but at least they know the material reality. There's no space there for them to have delusions about it. They blame the wrong thing. They, sometimes get swept up into anti-immigrant frenzy, stuff like that. There's a lot of very hard work to be done. I'm under no illusions about this, but that must be the way forward. I mean, to go back to a heroic example, Lenin looked at the Russian peasantry in the early 20th century, a group that was routinely swept up into anti-Semitic pogroms and prone to vast superstitions, religious fanaticism, but saw within its class relationship with the landlords and the growing capitalist class the basis for growing an alliance with the proletariat and basing a revolutionary party on that. It saw beyond the day-to-day into the nature of the contradictions in Russian society and the potential usage, of the peasantry as a revolutionary force in alliance with the proletariat. There's the same kind of analysis we need to carry out in the West, which is identify the revolutionary elements that can be brought towards communist parties in the proletariat, start to organize on that basis, know that in the initial period, we as communists in the West are a minority within a minority. But it is our basis to slowly put together, alternative structures for people to educate and, to use Gramsci's example, to create new organic intellectuals of the class who can put forward in their communities and in their workplaces a different point of view than the bourgeois run media channels, than the bourgeois propaganda system. And to a certain degree, it's positive in a sense, at the moment, because more and more people are switching off, like the BBC. More and more people are not reading the daily press, like the Sun, Daily Mail, Guardian, all these newspapers that were dominant 20 years ago, losing readers all the time. Yes, people are getting their news from various strange YouTube channels, not mine, others, but they are they are at least turning away from the main sources of bourgeois propaganda. Our job is to get in there and actually give them the proper way to understand the world. So in all of Europe now, I'll conclude on this point, we are facing a situation where we have to rebuild from the ground upwards. We are facing a situation where we have to essentially bring an understanding to people that so much of what we have grown up with is and are lies about the nature of the countries we live in, about their relationship with the rest of the world, about why the condition of the country only gets worse, and yet a tiny less than 1% of the population only seems to get richer. And on that basis, that will be we'll build a solid base towards real change, because real change cannot come through any of the parliamentary structures of Europe now, not on the current balance of forces. It is just not possible to get anything through there, left or right. And only by a comprehensive rebuild of the communist movement in the West, learning from Marxism as it has been developed through the Eastern countries, only on that basis can we go forward. Because if we get onto Western Marxism, I'll be here for another 2 hours. But just to say that Western Marxism also needs to be jettisoned, because that has only given us a legacy of betrayal and capitulation. And that's something that we need to thoroughly understand when we are in our rebuilding process.
Yeah, just a minor comment, maybe a book recommendation. I just finished the book Western Marxism by, I think, Domenico Lucerdo is the author's name. Yeah, it was quite striking, because I had the good fortune not to read most of the quote unquote Western Marxist he criticizes in the book, but it was quite a revelatory examination of how they think, which to put it in just a few words, seems basically like your typical European ideology of supremacy, cultural, well, primarily cultural and intellectual, applied in the realm of politics to people that are ostensibly on the left, but nonetheless can't seem to really grasp how Marxists in other countries outside of the developed core might think differently from them, because they're facing radically different problems than the Western Marxists. But anyway, it sounds like you've read the book. Would you recommend that or another one?
Well, I haven't actually read that book yet, but I've read a lot of Lizardo's other work where he makes that point quite powerfully. But my party, Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists, we actually launched a book just on Saturday of this week just gone, criticizing Trotskyism, which is, of course, one of the bedrocks of Western Marxism is Trotskyism, the fake alternative that is very heavily sponsored by the bourgeoisie. And we were making at that meeting we had on Saturday a lot of these similar points, which is this is a pro-imperialist fake alternative that justifies Western supremacism using a lot of very left-wing language, which derives ultimately from Trotsky himself, who made the specific argument that the Russian Revolution cannot possibly succeed without the assistance of Germany and the other already developed industrialized countries. And that is a perspective that the Trotskyites take everywhere they go with them. And unsurprisingly, therefore, in most of the Eastern countries, Trotskyism goes absolutely nowhere. But in the West, it's incredibly powerful because it centers the West still as the basis upon the center point around which the world orbits, and won't be able to handle the change. And so what we argue is that without a serious study of the experience of Marxism in the Soviet Union, China, the DPRK, the liberation struggles in Africa and in Latin America, we've got no chance of rebuilding. Because the thing is, in imperialism in its decaying form, some of the conditions that were present there are coming here, and the imperialist methods of managing their domination of those countries, they're bringing here. They've already deployed them here many times. So that is the approach we must use now. We must critique and move past this Western Marxist and Trotskyite and heavily academic model to one that actually responds to the objective needs of the class, the working class, in the situation we're in now. Not only learns from the class, but also is prepared to take back the leadership of the positions of a communist party to the class, and to interact constantly with workers to start that process of changing consciousness. Long process. We're going to face a lot of authoritarian measures and state repression. A lot of it's being unleashed already in the West, but there's no alternative. It's either that or these countries just will go under. And if people don't believe that, powerful imperial core countries can go under, historically, there's quite a few examples of that. But we have examples in the world to draw from. There are countries in the world whereby if there is a change in Britain or France or any country, where countries like Russia and China are prepared to still trade with us if we make that change. We wouldn't be isolated. It wouldn't be Russia in 1918 anymore, which is a nation cut off from the world. We have trading networks that we can tap into, but it depends upon us moving beyond the domination of this current ruling class. And without applying this Marxism as it has been developed throughout the rest of the world, we're just going to keep in the same old cycle. So this must be our priority now.
Thank you very much for spending the time with us today. I really appreciate it. It was a great chat.
Very, very
Thank you for having me on,
excellent.
guys.
Yeah, very excellent, Alexander. I just knew that you would be the right one to give us an update about the things that are going on. And forgive me, but I'm telling you right now, we are probably going to invite you again in the future. So be prepared.
Happy to come on anytime, guys. Thank you for the discussion. It's always interesting.
All right, fantastic,
Great.
and have a good
Alexander.
day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.